In the introduction to his new book, Dr. Christopher Beem, managing director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy, writes, "The last few years have demonstrated that we cannot rely on procedures to save us from our tribalistic selves. We need to recover a shared commitment to a democratic virtue." In the 7 democratic virtues, Dr. Beem expertly lays out a plan to help us improve not only as democratic citizens, but as people. It's a great read, and we're honored to have you on. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Can you first talk about the book and what inspired you to write it?
Well, I mean, I actually say a little bit about this in the book. I just kept, we would go out and do, events around the city or around the community, and I'd also go to parties and people found out what I do for a living, and they asked me, and then students would ask me, what can I do? I'm a concerned citizen, what can I do? And I just kept getting this question, and I'd have an answer, but I just didn't think it was very good. And it was a sincere question, and it reflected their concern about the world, and I just felt like I had a certain responsibility to try to give a better answer than I had. And so I just kind of sat and thought about it, or actually I was actually walking from the bus, and I'm like, I can tell you the square on the sidewalk where I'm like, oh, this is a book. And so, and then I just kind of came in here and started writing stuff down, and the rest, as they say, is history.
There we go. And so you start out with a chapter on tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what tribalism is, how it starts, and the innate nature of it?
Sure. Well, that's the point. It doesn't start. We're born with it, right? And this is as well established as just about anything, in human genetics, that, however far back you want to take human evolution, let's just say 100,000 years, this was hominids living on the savanna in Africa.
Right.
And it was a very scary place. And I actually, a couple years pre-COVID, I went to South Africa and went to Kruger National Park, and it really gave me insight into how scary it was to be a human being, right? And because there's animals who can kill you, and they're everywhere, and you can't see them. Anyway, the point is, there's a point here.
It's the constant adrenaline rush.
Well, and a lot of people didn't make it. A lot of humans didn't make it, and the humans that did banded into tribes.
Right.
Right, and so they did that because it gave them the ability to defend themselves against these predators. It also gave them a better ability to hunt, right, cooperatively. And so for these humans, survival and success depended upon their ability to form these tribes. And the fact that it was successful is the reason why all of us have that same tendency. It is literally like we decided to walk upright, right? And that became our evolutionary advantage. We're built for running in a way that most longer distance running, where most animals can't. And so that was our genetic advantage. And so all these things are just kind of there. They're part of all of us as human beings. So tribalism is not a problem. Tribalism now is expressed in a variety of ways. But the most obvious and the most relevant, here in Penn State and just about anywhere, is sports, right? We all kind of identify with teams. And in a way that it's just absurd for me as a 61-year-old man to attach so much emotion and commitment to these 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds out there on the field, but we all do it, right? And that's tribalism, right? We connect to these people. We see their success connected to our own success. And we approach, the way we approach sports is manifested throughout the world in that there is an us and there is a them. There's an inside the tribe and there's the outside the tribe. And there's also an enormous amount of evidence from psychology that us versus them also translates into we look more favorably on anybody that's in us, and we look less favorably. We are more likely to see negatively anybody who's in them.
Right.
All right? So that is human nature, no way to get around it.
Yes.
That's not the problem.
Right.
The problem is when all our tribes line up. Excuse me. So in regular, everyday life, you and I both have a lot of tribes that we belong to. And some of them overlap, some of them are the same, some of them are very different, right?
Right.
And, you are the same person whether you're in, church in a different kind of church, Beaver Stadium, when you're in classroom, when you're, with your boys and you're hanging out or whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, these are all different tribes. They're all you, but they all kind of push and pull you in different ways, right?
Sure.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's the human condition.
There's
But
a
when
coming.
when all those tribes line up, and when a human society, when any society is divided such that there are very few opportunities where your tribe connects you to the other side, and you are basically lined up in terms of every aspect of your life reinforces one big us and one big them,
Right.
that's a problem.
Yes.
And so that's what I'm arguing is happening right now in America. And it's important to understand these are partisan identities, right? Republican, Democrat, red, blue, but they don't have much at all to do with policy or even with ideology, right? I mean, people say, why are we so polarized? People, gun control, the numbers are 80%, has nothing to do with it.
Right.
Nothing to do with it. It's about identity. And that's why it's tribalism, not polarization. That's what I called it, right?
Yes.
So the point is that we come to identify these policy positions as yet another way of manifesting this underlying split.
Right.
And so that's a problem, because when it becomes complete, you end up with two groups that not only don't know each other, don't trust each other, they become ever closer to animosity and ever closer to enmity. And once that happens, society is very difficult to sustain.
Yes. And it feels like we're in one of those states right now.
Well, that's what I think. That's why I wrote the book.
And what I like about the book is that it's not all doom and gloom. You give us some tips and a little bit of advice as to how we can overcome this aforementioned animosity. And one of the virtues that I found very interesting was that of humility. Can we first talk about the definition of humility that you argue for in this book?
Sure. It's not what you might think of and what many philosophers have thought of in terms of being like a sense of moral or self-abnegation.
Right.
Like, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. That's not what humility means. Humility means essentially knowing the truth about yourself and acting accordingly. So, I take this from a monk who lived in the 13th century,
Right.
Bernard of Clairvaux. And, he talks about this in very Christian terms, right? And basically his argument is that, if we compare ourselves to God, then all of us are not only sinners, we're all just infinitesimally small, and there's nothing that justifies us thinking of ourselves as higher than somebody else.
Right.
That's not what I think, or that's not my argument. But his position is grounded on the idea that that this is the truth about the human condition, and we need to operate accordingly. And that when we do that, we are acting with humility. And so with regards to democratic humility, I'm arguing that we are all biased. That's part of tribalism too, that we see the world in how we want it to be rather than how it really is. And we can't undo that either, right? It's just kind of part of how we're wired. But if you are if you're unwilling to acknowledge that fact, if you are unable or unwilling to say we're all biased and we all come into these arguments with failures amongst ourselves, then it's impossible for us to have it's much more difficult to have a productive argument. So once we recognize that we're all failing to see the world as it really is, if that's even possible, and that the way we approach reality is inexorably compromised by our own bias and our own identity, then it's very difficult for us to get to a point where we can argue constructively. And the problem now is that we have developed, well, not we, but our society has developed these models, business models, for encouraging you to forget that you have a bias, that you don't see the world correctly. They're perfectly willing to say the other side doesn't see it correctly, and the other side is biased. And it's very easy for us to see the bias in other people. It's very difficult for us to see it in ourselves. And so that's all that humility means. It means, first of all, this is true, right? No matter what you think about whether you like it or not, it's true, right? And so it is prudent for all of us to go into arguments where we both recognize this. And this is a way to make our argument more productive.
Absolutely. And I think there's also an interesting relationship between humility and tribalism. Because when we do start to point out the differences between ourselves and maybe other members of the group, when we do start to point out the confirmation biases and the other biases that we have, we put ourselves at risk of alienation. And we might be ostracized from the group.
Right.
So if we're going to assume, and we should, that tribalism is here to stay, how do we reckon with that disparity?
Well, you're absolutely right. And that's why courage is one of the virtues. It's easy right now for us to, manifest. It's comparatively easy for us to manifest courage and yell at people on the other side. Right. Happens all the time in ways that are more or less awful and more or less destructive. But it's very hard for us to speak out against the confirmation bias in our own group. And if anything, the data is pretty clear that when we're in a group, when everybody thinks the same, the normal thing that happens is that we escalate up our positions, such that if we're really not liking something, by the time the conversation's over, we really don't like it, right? And so to step into that and to say, wait a minute, is that really true? Or is that really how they think? Or can't we give them frame this in a way that makes them not look quite so evil or stupid or un-American or, whatever you want to say? That requires courage, and there is a genuine fear of ostracism. In the book I talk about David Brooks, who is a very, very famous, very well compensated conservative, right? And he came out against Trump, and he said nobody would call me, nobody would return my calls. I mean, all of his friends had ostracized him, and he said for a while there the weekends were howling silences. I just remember that because it's that sounds pretty bad. That sounds pretty bad.
And for someone of his status,
right?
Too,
Exactly. If that's happening to him, imagine how it would happen for just regular schlubs like you and me. And so it is a very courageous thing to stand up to that. The more, I guess the more positive example is Liz Cheney, right? I don't think she and I politically would agree on the color of the sky.
Yeah.
But I have nothing but admiration for her courage. And, you know, will it work out? Will it not? I bet she sleeps well at night.
Right.
Know? And I think that her willingness to step up and do that is grounded in her love of country, which is, you know, not a bad thing to ground your virtue in.
Absolutely. I think we've alluded to this a few times before. We've mentioned some of the biases that we have. Can you delve into those a little bit more? Because I
Sure.
think that's important for people to understand.
I mean, there's, you know, I mentioned some in the book. I mean, there are over 100 documented biases.
Right. Can you list every single one?
I cannot, and it would really bore the hell out of anybody listening to this. Some of these are just kind of obvious. You know, you'll hear them and you'll go, oh yeah, I guess I do that. Like there is a last piece of information bias that you hear that and you're more likely to give that weight versus something else. The other thing is the first piece of information bias. Right? You hear something, you form an idea in your head, and no matter how much you hear, right, it's not going to get you off that.
Absolutely.
People are more biased, or are more likely to listen to somebody who is good looking.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so, you know, and then so those are kind of like, you know, benign. You know, when you're in a cocktail party, you can talk about them or whatever. Yeah. But in terms of tribalism, bias is, again, associated with this us versus them. And it just means that when you identify the person that's talking to you as them, you are less likely to give credence to what they say, less likely to take it seriously, more likely to come up with reasons to dismiss it. You are also more likely to look at the them as being a collective that doesn't have a lot of nuance, or sorry, there's a little fuzzy, a lot of nuance or distinctiveness to it, right? The bigot says, oh, well, they're all alike, right? They all look alike, they all act alike, they're all lazy, they're all, you know, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
That is far and away, obviously, the worst manifestation of that, but it is a manifestation that is endemic to us. When we see the other, all those biases start to click in. I did a class, somebody else's class was actually Matt Jordan's class, and I said, and if you don't believe me, I'll prove it to you. And this was right after, which game was it? Oh, damn it. I think it was the Purdue game.
Okay, first game of the year.
No, yeah. Anyway, it was right after that game, so I knew it was all fresh in their mind. And I said, show of hands, how many of you think that targeting call was legitimate? Not one hand that went up.
Yeah.
And I said, now, we do the same exact class, only it's in West Lafayette, Indiana. How many hands go up?
Yeah.
Right? It's the same phenomenon. We both saw the same thing.
Right.
Why do we see it completely differently? It's our bias.
Right.
Right? And so I didn't think it was a good call either.
I wonder why.
but that's, again, sports is no big deal, right? We all recognize at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It's entertainment.
Well, most of us.
I mean, we should understand that more. But it's not going to change our lives. It's really entertaining. It's fun to go. It's fun to be crazy and whatever. But it's not.
Absolutely.
It's not really that. But when you talk about something more, like politics or like someone's well-being, then it becomes a big deal. And I'm putting this in your head, keep an ear out for when you hear somebody using dehumanizing language.
So earlier you mentioned the use of dehumanizing terms and that we should keep an ear out for them. What do those sound like? Well,
the most classic example is that in a war, each side comes up with you know, awful nicknames for the other side.
Right.
And there's a very good reason they do that, because it's easier to kill that that epithet than it is to kill a human being.
Absolutely.
So that's that's the most obvious example. But whenever you hear people talk about animals, Donald Trump did this all the time. The animals who are marching for Black Lives Matter. Or thugs, or there was just something on Twitter, I can't remember what it was, but it was like, I just saw it, I'm like, there it is. But it again is a natural manifestation of this kind of tribalistic bias, but it's also very dangerous, because these are people that we ostensibly they're our fellow citizens, and we're trying to live together in some kind of peaceful society.
Absolutely. And the use of those terms is definitely a manifestation of anger. And one way to combat that is with temperance. Anger is described in the book by two political scientists as, quote, the essential political emotion. And you argue, and so does Aristotle, that that's not necessarily a bad thing, that anger in a democracy is good because it fuels our democratic actions. It takes us to the streets to protest, it helps us get to the ballot box and vote. But can you explain a little bit about how anger can be handled appropriately and when it spills over into an unhealthy kind of anger?
Well, that's all correct, right? Aristotle says, if you're angry about the right thing in the right way, to the right degree, at the right person, then there's nothing wrong with it. It can be part of a virtuous life. Right. And there's a lot of ancients who don't think that, right? That the Stoics, for example, just said you let anger in the door, it's over, because it's gonna rule things.
Yeah.
But in a democracy, it's a lot more like Aristotle, right? A democracy assumes that you're going to get angry, right? Our society is grounded on the idea that we're not going to agree.
Sure.
And many of the things we're not going to agree on are very important to us, right? If you are an ardent supporter of the Second Amendment, you're going to get angry when you hear my opinions, right? If you are, abortion, there's not a lot of room for somebody to have an opinion there and not be angry at the other side.
Right. And I think that's an interesting thing about democracy, is that, people who aren't in positions to make these important decisions, they get to be a little bit indifferent. And they may be able to hold more moderate opinions, but people in power need to make decisions.
Right.
We need regulations on certain things, or
Right.
a lack of them. So how do we respond to the inevitable decisions that courts are going to come up with, that politicians are going to enact into law?
Well, it's some of it's just in the Constitution, right? in the Constitution. The Bill of Rights, First Amendment, says we have the right. It's the one. There's five, right?
Yeah.
Freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and then the freedom or the right to petition grievance.
Right.
So grievance means we're angry about something that somebody did. The right to assembly means we have the right to march against something we don't like. But in the Constitution, it says we have the right peaceably to assembly, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have a right. You don't have a right to a riot,
right?
But you do have the right to assemble and speak and protest. Same thing with grievance. You have the right to petition to grievance, right? Petition means ask, or to put out a formal request. It doesn't mean you have the right to just take it.
Yeah.
Right? And so there are constraints within the Constitution itself about what's legitimate. But in the book, I'm trying to distinguish between anger and hatred, right? So I don't think that it's realistic or even useful to talk about the idea that let's all agree about this, right?
Sure.
That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And as much as we might, wish it would, as much as we might like the idea of a society in which there wasn't this kind of anger, it's just not. That's what you sign up for when you sign up for a democracy.
Absolutely.
However, Aristotle says there's a big difference between anger on the one hand and hatred on the other. And hatred, when you hate the other person, then it becomes very difficult to sustain a democracy, right? If you hate the other person, I mean, I'm trying, I don't know if I'll get them all, but there's three things that distinguish hatred from anger. One is that it's directed towards groups rather than individual. Two is that it lasts. Anger can be an emotion that kind of peaks and goes away. Hatred is just abiding. It becomes part of an identity. And then the third thing is that anger can be dealt with, right? If Aristotle talks about vengeance, but even if you just kind of, respond in a way that makes you feel better, well, then you feel better, right? Hatred, Aristotle says the only way to get rid of that is to get rid of the person, right? That you just want that person to cease to exist. And so when you're talking about a democracy, hatred becomes untenable, right? If you hate that person, compromise is impossible. Coalition building is impossible. Right. And most relevantly, if you hate this person, or you hate this group, I should say, it's very difficult for you to just accept with equanimity if that group wins.
Right.
And so you look for ways to undermine their election, to dispute, denigrate, and maybe even look to other ways to solve your problem outside of an election. And that means, and so anger, have to accept it. It's part of being in a democracy. Hatred is just too much, and it destroys democracy. So we have to find ways to move away from hatred back into anger.
Yeah.
And that's what I really think we are. I mean, I think there's a lot of hatred out there. But for whatever reason, whether it's legitimate or not, it's just not sustainable. So we have to find ways to step back.
Yeah, and one thing that is kind of adding fuel to the fire with our hatred is the media. And you argue that we should look for ways to limit our consumption of the media,
right,
and do some other things to step away from politics and find community. I think you mentioned like adult sports leagues is a good way to do that. How do you see those two things as limiting our anger and also helping us find a healthier sense of community?
I know how this sounds. I know this sounds really, really corny, but there is evidence, right? When you are not connected to, when you don't interact with people on the other side, it is not just easy, it's almost inevitable that you're going to caricaturize them, that you're going to misapprehend their points of view and their motivation. Right. And it's going to be a lot worse than it actually is. If you go into a partisan group, now there are lots of groups in American civil society, millions, tens of millions, right? But many of them have been subsumed by this partisan divide, right? Even the ones that didn't used to be, right? Churches, right, are didn't used to be, or at least didn't used to be as express so much animosity as they do now. But many of them do. So you go to church, it's not going to help, right? Not going to help this issue anyway. And so it takes some doing to find groups, activities, whatever, where there is the genuine opportunity to meet people who are on the other side of this divide. Right. And so adult sports leagues is one. If you find some nonprofit that is connected to something that you like anyway, my sister trains dogs for veterans, disabled people, whatever, right? There is a lot of diversity there in terms of politics, but it doesn't matter because they're all so focused on training these dogs, right? And so when you do that, right? When you interact with people who are different from you, and you work together with them around a common goal, it is, again, demonstrable scientifically that you will find it harder to hate that person. You will find it, your opinion of them will go up. And it's just human nature, right? It's when you're on this, some social media platform, and you have an avatar. Avatar? Do they still call them avatars? I don't know. All right. Or just a tag name, whatever. Yeah. It's easy to be an asshole. Oh, right? Yeah. It's easy, and there's no, all you get is just this furtherance of this animosity, but there's no comeuppance, right? You're in your room. You're behind your keyboard. Yeah, exactly, and no one's gonna come and get you. So you can say things that are really nasty and cruel, and people do it all the time. When you're doing that face to face, it's much harder to do that. It's much harder because there's this human interaction between us. It's also harder because you don't know how they're going to react. Yeah. I mean, it's their big brother behind a corner or something, right? So it's just a one way, and it's a little way, but it is a good way for us to overcome the separation between us and force us to see each other as human beings. And that goes for both sides, right? This is not just something that, people left of center should do. Right. It's all of us should be doing. Absolutely. And I kind of want to delve more into that social media question. What do you think the role has been of social media in creating this sense of conflict and this anger? And do you think we need to get off social media to mitigate the effects of that? Well, I mean, at minimum, we need to recognize what's going on, right? We need to recognize that this is a business model that is extremely successful. It makes those people a lot of money. Right. And the reason it works is because our brain, our tribalistic brain, wants to hear people talk about us, right? I say it's no accident that it's called Fox and Friends, right? We're all friends here. We're all on the same page, right? Yeah. And then to have someone say, as happens on both MSNBC and Fox, we're the good Americans. We're the ones who are smart. We're the ones who are moral, and everybody on the other side is not. And that's why I argue for consistency, right? Because it's too easy for us to see those on our side as being, righteous. Yeah. And if we're talking about behavior, if we're talking about virtues, if it's bad for them, it's bad for me. Yeah. If it's good for them, if it's good for me, it's good for them. Yeah. And that is a way of combating these biases. But it requires sometimes a lot of discipline. And there is no discipline associated with a lot of social media. It's just giving you what you want, and it works because it kicks in dopamine, and dopamine is a really good feel-good drug. Yeah. And that's why they get rich. And so, at minimum, it's not worth going into, but I have an acquaintance, I guess I call him a friend, who's on the other side. And he was telling me about watching Tucker Carlson. I said, don't do that right before you go to bed. It's not good for you. He goes, well, you were just saying that. I'm like, no. It doesn't matter which side you're on. It's just not physically healthy for you to get yourself riled up like that right before you go to sleep. For sure. So anyway, just recognize that you're being marketed to and that you're being manipulated, and that, you'd be better off if you got off. Most likely.
All right. Thank you so much. Those were all the questions I had. I'll give you the floor if you want to close with any last thoughts, or if you want to tell people where they can get the 7 democratic virtues.
7 democratic virtues. Amazon. If you don't want to go Amazon, PSU Press has it. I think. Damn it! What's the name of the? Just blanking on it. The independent bookstore down in Webster's.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow, that is not cool. That I could not come up with it. But anyway, but I guess what I would say is, I did not write this for academics.
Right.
And I try to make it accessible. And my objective is to give people something that they can do, right? Instead of just despairing and being so frustrated and angry about what they see, of course you should vote. Of course you should vote. And of course you should be engaged in your election and in the election that's coming up. And you should even I'm absolutely fine with you identifying with a partisan side and working for that, right? Writing a check, going to a food bank, whatever. But it is also important for all of us to work towards virtues that are going to help us step back from this brink. And so I'm hoping that it's a book that's empowering. And you know what? I also say, even if it doesn't work, as you mentioned, right? For Aristotle, virtues is not about being a good person.
Right.
It's about being an excellent person.
Yes.
It's about being, behaving in a way that, is the best of human beings. And I feel the same way about the democratic virtues. Even if this doesn't work, even if our democracy goes down in flames, it's still worth doing because it's part of all of our effort to become the best person we can be.
Very well said. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.